Hello everyone, another question and answer video today from a user tells us, pre-chivalric mounted warfare has always interested me. I've always been curious to what degree the stirrup had an effect on cavalry doctrine. There seems to be a consensus on couching the lance being out prior to stirrup's introduction, but the fact that Xenophon's and later Alexander's cavalry seem to have been used as a shock force makes me wonder if the stirrup was the paradigm shift it's been made out to be. Right, so actually I've already talked profusely about this in Schwerpunkt, but never made a video on it, and at some point I will specifically make one dedicated, in detail to the things. But the question is always interesting because in fact it's a common question. It's been asked multiple times in the past, and it tells me, of course, as I'm aware of the spread of this, the idea that somewhat it's the technology that makes tactics, while it's actually the other way around, right? And the difference here between tactics and doctrine is factually, the fact that tactics is how you basically win battles, right? Practically. Doctrine is something, if you want, anachronistic from these times, but that still fits. I've been using it myself for pre-modern. Let's say when doctrine started becoming in modern and contemporary history properly, something fully rationalized and criticized and inquired as such on, a set of understanding, of knowledge, and that is studied and refined, etc., on how to employ your forces to the strategical as much as the tactical aims. And so basically I already answered the question. Well, actually a very few, right? The stirrup in itself didn't quite have the impact that we think. And let's say today we know it. These were ideas that were, I think, fashionable until maybe the 60s, the 70s, not even. I guess, especially looking at the best of military historiography on medieval warfare and so on. Naturally, there is a difference between ancient and medieval cavalry. We often tend here, it's not about the question itself, but in general, as a reminder, I think we tend to forget the fact that cavalry wasn't born yesterday, but the day before, let's say, and that it had an evolution, so also a technical one, over a certain time, let's say, with the changing of the world and of the peoples and their politics, their military organization accordingly. Right? If you look at the history of steppes warfare, for example, you see there in among peoples that apparently had, after all, a very similar lifestyle throughout the eras, actually an imposant transformation that goes along with various waves of peoples, and empires that succeeded themselves in the steppe, but also, and of course, the relation, the clash, the meeting with the sedentary cultures and so on, and naturally the permeation, the intersections with the same. Cavalry, this is pretty universal. It's always simpler than it sounds. Cavalry has only one function: attack. Right? There is no other thing cavalry can do per se. Right? When missile is in between, like it's like an overlapping, but cavalry in itself always have, even if the lightest of cavalry, just for the fact that there is a mass, an imposing mass launched at an important speed, it makes offensive action dramatically intense, while cavalry, while it sits down, it stays idling. Basically, it's completely vulnerable because it cannot defend unless you dismount it, and in that case, it becomes infantry. So, also much of cavalry tactics naturally were connected to this aspect, and that's also what doctrine and the practice of warfare is about. It's not much about a completely functionalized reality that happens all in the same way, but banally, if you catch the enemy by unaware, and you've not lined up, not ordered, etc., you charge him, it's done, right? This is true, and for infantry, in a sense, there is every tactical situation is different. Every arm can find itself in different situations, but these are fundamentally standard. So cavalry, of course, as the question says, in ancient times, right, in every time. Here the example is Xenophon. So we are in a time which actually cavalry was developing in a context of essentially a phalangitic warfare still, but that was seeing much more tactically articulated specialization in warfare in the first place, and against peoples, by the way, that also made an important amount of mounted combat. And of course Alexander's Macedonian cavalry, that was basically the strongest one. It's essentially the product of a virtually feudal society like the ancient Macedonian one was, that without which you really can't have a strong cavalry otherwise, and that at least among the sedentary peoples, that in fact brought in the art of war this more intensely specialized tactical concept. It was, however, all there in combined arms, in this case of anvil and hammer, and that we all know, right? So these cavalries, of course, charged, and they charged like hell, right? Never think that these were like weaker, or that infantry, for that matter, was just, they are simply saying, I don't know, whatever they launch at us, we will fundamentally resist. This is not true at many levels, also considering sometimes what is generally overlooked about ancient warfare, that is how much mounted troops existed at some point, some battlefields, and how infantry, albeit remaining essentially the decisive arm throughout all ancient warfare, it was still quite mindful of cavalry's shock power. This wasn't dramatic as the medieval one, right? In antiquity, there were things like hipposyndals that weren't quite like horseshoeing like we see in later times, and so there was less grip on the ground. There was, in general, in strictly technical terms, there weren't stirrups, in fact. But that's not the point, right? The point there is the reason why we assist this transition, this development fundamentally during mostly the early Middle Ages, and sometimes it's difficult to measure it accurately because also other concepts, like for example that in late antiquity cavalry was this dramatic much. Well, there were strong cavalries around, but infantry was still decisive. Especially in Western Europe, early medieval times weren't marked by a dramatically intense military activity compared to previous and later times, properly because resources were weren't there. But this is true largely also for other areas of the world at the time. So the documentation is what it is. So we see definitely that cavalry is rising in importance, that ever since cavalry had been born, let's say, in all these waves from the steppes that had invested, Europe as well as other areas, etc., had left a very strong mark, right? If you look, for example, but it was a cultural one, even before a technical one, was properly the idea that the freemen, even in cultures that have been portrayed to us too often like, republican and democratic, and based on the ideal of the citizen soldier who was an infantryman, all these things actually were soaked completely into a radically violent military religious idea that revolved exclusively around mounted warfare, right? And something like even the Romans fit perfectly in this thing. And what we assist to during the migration era, that surely brought a lot of that like straight from the core lands where those ideas had originated, right? And that actually even in Europe, in the sedentary world, we hadn't quite forgotten at the time, in spite of how we fought. Like if you look, for example, at Germanic warfare in ancient history, right? The Germans notoriously didn't make up an extensive use of cavalry in combat. They had it. Some of it was also very well was very well cohesed. Look at, I don't know, the Germanic cavalry during the Gallic Wars that, Caesar gives, the Roman equites horses to in order to cope with that, because what they were really, and that they rode even without saddle, without any kind of, because they thought it was something effeminate, right? And reflecting these concepts and what it means, to fight in certain conditions, and why they would prefer to do that rather than another thing. It's not a merely ideal thing. There are reasons there. We'll explain in a while. So in the migration here, we see this dramatic reinjection of mounted warfare, from peoples such as the Alans, for example, but this could be extended to all the Sarmatian peoples, and at some point we talk, in fact, even of Sarmato-Germanic military cultures, looking especially at the Eastern Germans and how they had essentially blended together with these peoples of Iranic stock that at the end of the day they disappeared in great part as ethnic identities, but you understand that the people genetically went somewhere. This shifted mostly towards the west, and there is a remarkable impact that is also probably overlooked in properly providing to Western culture and warfare this idea of something that is literally denied. Right, it's not just the mounted warfare. It's thinking about the Alans specifically, and this almost fish scale armor figures, in fact, covered in metal from head to toe, that were all one with these people's religious ideas of, in fact, gods made of iron, and having always their horse in all the mythology. You see it everywhere, right? Think about the Vandal eras. Think even just about the 8th century, where the Carolingians had began to catalyze already this de facto professional systems that was unknown in the West of heavy cavalry, that they still attributed to peoples like the Visigoths or the Longobards this primacy in equestrian skills, because at the roots of those people was almost obsession for this mounted, right? And this was the universal beliefs that actually the West stems from, together with other cultures, frankly, but probably the idea of the heavily armored knight, right? That this is something that was probably that reshaped Europe in itself through the new political and social models that were brought with the migration era. In a sense, what you see in early medieval times, independently from our capacity to measure it properly of how it was on the field, because the battle accounts are ridiculously scarce and they don't even explain a big deal. Like, just think that of all the Carolingian warfare, that basically is all what the Franks did, because they literally had no other cultural meaning in their mental horizon whatsoever, is the Battle of Zumtel. Right, it was also one of the few Carolingian defeats at that time. But for the rest, there is a huge debate even how large Carolingian armies were, what was the proportion of mounted and foot troops. What we understand, though, is that from that culture, from especially Gaul per se, and that there was during early we could even insert the late antiquity in that, but all more safely the early Middle Ages, the catalyzation of a process of privatization of power that essentially was a proto-feudalism. At least, the term feudalism is debated in so many ways, but conceptually we know what we mean. It's essentially the idea that there is there are still some public universal points of reference, but fundamentally power is de facto held by some landlords that control most of the lands, or at least that in fact most of the communities depend on, right, for their own military defense, and that at that point they cooperate in conditions of military threat, with the same lords that in this sense acquire ever more control in conditions of emergency on communities. There is all an interesting kind of moral dimension of this, of how the masses had gradually being ousted from this, also the political participation in a sense. So this was different in different areas of Europe, and that's why Gaul, northern Gaul, and the heartland of Carolingian power during the 9th century, etc., was the cradle of what we see eventually as later on as chivalry, and all of this world that eventually was to expand and to overflow from those regions, basically all over Europe and mostly in the West, but let's say essentially first of all in all post-Carolingian kingdoms, and then from there beyond, right, with the Normans in England, in Sicily, then when the Western influences in the Reconquista in Scandinavia, the Western Slavs and so on. So, and even after the conquest of Constantinople 1204, even the same Greece and beyond with the Crusades before, but also with the continued Western presence in Mediterranean, was dominated there, also at sea. And this is part of a broader development that has virtually nothing to do with any, as you understand, even dialectically, with any technicality, any specific technology or this or that, right? We should make a very powerful digression on the meaning properly, how of the history of technology, how technology develops and why, right? To make the long story short, technology is created in order to fit a pre-existing reality, right? In order, of course, to, let's say, solve some problems, but problems that in this sense can be scientifically spotted and say, okay, we can factually improve at least part of what we are already doing through this extra, thing. And the Stirrup has to be read in that sense, but not as if the tactics, for example, that existed at the time had developed or had anything to do with the introduction of the Stirrup or any other specific technology per se, because these technologies were fundamentally the product of a context that either for the first time could afford it. This is evident, for example, in arms and armor development in general. The Stirrup is fundamentally a very simple thing, right? It doesn't require any specific science or great understanding or whatever. It's just a support to offer more stability on horseback. We know that in the Western steppes, even in antiquity, there was in part it's hypothetical, in part not, but given that there weren't stirrups around, at least up to a certain point. And cavalry did charge, and it charged like hell, especially about among those Scythian Sarmatian peoples. That was all a set of straps fundamentally to keep the horsemen, especially when charging with holding the contest, the lance, this massive lance, with both hands and maximizing the impact. With these horses, by the way, they were bred especially to be extremely obedient at every single hint of the horsemen, and that functioned that way for a long time. The same can go for the aforementioned cavalries that the author of the question was pointing to. All these cavalries charged, right? And when you see even during the migration, the introduction of the Stirrup, that in Europe is, and in Western Europe specifically, is being, but in Europe in general, let's say better, is credited mostly not to an Eastern medium, or better, like a Mediterranean medium, like the Persians. It's being pointed out because the Sassanids were famous for this important armored mounted warfare that actually decreased from the cataphract form of the Parthians into something actually more mediated and tactically specialized, and that lightened actually the heavier horseman armor up to basically eventually when the Sassanids were taken out in the 7th century, and that instead is attributed mostly to the Avars. Right, and there is a great debate because people say, well, but surely some Stirrup might have filtered. Yes, but the important there is that not even when the Avars had stirrups settled in the center of Europe, and other people began to cope with them because they started to launch raids from in any direction into Merovingian Germany, into the Byzantine Empire, and so on. Of course, the idea is that the stirrup was at least more evidently, at least it was a people that made use of it substantially for us to acknowledge the fact that, again, that was a way of war, not much the Stirrup in itself, but again, with the others, this, formidable military machine with, very heavy cavalry of that model that was, at that point, not Indo-European, but rather Turkic, even though they brought themselves partly as this still relics of other peoples in the steppes which they had mixed themselves. It's not important, because in the steppe, what is ethnically meant, it's also of relative importance given how quickly things changed. And that therefore was, again, their injection of this very heavy cavalry for Western standards, even though we have to realize, again, and I'm getting to the point, that the reason why these cultures had, for example, a more evidently heavier component of cavalry doesn't actually mean that this was, like, for example, a quantitative standard. Like, steppes peoples normally had actually a narrower, quantitatively speaking, amount of heavily armored horsemen than in the West. This is debatable depending on the kind of people, right? There were people that, were richer per capita, could, afford, like, better armament on a certain amount of men. These are calculations that it also depends on the steppes people, like the most florid, those who had looted the most, let's say, in a way. The steppe peoples, for example, had a very advanced metallurgy, so that most of what are also the arms and armor development in the West fundamentally come from that direction, right? Even, I don't know, Celtic metallurgy back in the day was of Scythian origin. Like, here we are also going far back in time, where you can't even start distinguishing anymore the proto-Indo-Europeans between one another. But let's say that paradoxically, that was a more technologically advanced word for culture for metallurgy, but it wasn't for so much else, right? Actually, there were more primitive people in so many ways, while in the West there was a greater abundance of resources. It also made it less let's say, less important to have that specific type of cavalry, right? Because the community was less pressed in a sense, and it could operate on a larger scale, also on a more stable territoriality and a greater amount of fortification. These are all things that affect naturally also the nature of these very armies. The reason why the stirrup develops, let's say it spreads, in Western Europe, in Western warfare, is a consequence of a progressed or a contemporary development that, however, is truly, in causal terms, the overwhelmingly most important factor and decisive one for the adoption of even a certain, technology, or at least for the best functionalization of it, right? For the need of needing to adopt it in order to functionalize the activity that was already going on, right? And the reason why this change happened is what we were saying before about this increasing feudalization of Western communities, right? And what does happen in these communities, as we've seen before, there is one guy that fundamentally is the local landlord, right, and has an overwhelming power. Basically, all the world society works for him to be a factually professional warrior that that maximizes also his individuality on the base of properly mounted combat, which is something you can see, I don't know, even in the ancient world. Think about the Bronze Age and the use of chariot warfare, all these these heroes of the so-called heroic warfare and so on. While it is true that those cultures we were saying before, like the Greeks and the Romans, made extensive use of infantry and so on, this is more a relic of let's say of the tribal background, where yes, the hero still existed there, but still there were lots of other troops that as always had accompanied him, and that since these peoples at some point enriched themselves. I mean, think about Hellenic trade, or the Roman conquest of the surrounding world, etc., had provided the resources for maintaining a very high standard of infantry, right? In the Roman case, it's so evident, right? And the Roman legionary in itself is nothing but essentially the evolution of any other Indo-European warrior type that was practically identical all over, the sedentary world at that point. There isn't even there a specific technicality that makes, I don't know, the Roman legionary in itself like a as a monad, as a thing that it makes sense in a context, right? That mostly makes of an assault engineer, and that that is capable of adapting to certain circumstances, mostly because it's a professional trooper, first of all, but also because it has also all this, civilizational background that affords it to operate in a much more complex, articulated, and ultimately effective way than what other peoples could properly afford in terms of political cohesion, right, and material wealth and so on. So that the Roman combination is quite unique in its own kind, but even in there isn't any specific technology that, especially in the Roman case, that basically where they basically adopted technologies from peoples that had always kind of had them on their own, etc. That's not a shame either, right? Being able to adopt a technology has nothing to do with your backwardness. On the contrary, it has to do with the fact that not only you are at the same level because you have a same context where you can essentially adopt it, but when you improve it, like even like in a more developed system, that you have already gone past that thing and people are obsessed with technologism because sometimes they literally cannot read history without this delusion that technology is the thing that makes things work. And this is absolutely wrong in history of science, in history of technology, history of economics, right? This is not something that it's a personal opinion. It's just the average Westerner that has grown since the 19th century obsessed with the myth of progress and positivism and technologism. So the bullshit that in 2020 we had to live on Mars and eating peels and all this thing, that's not real, right? As much as it gets, and has nothing to do with factual reality, and especially the entire history of mankind. And so this is perhaps the single most deeply rooted and hardest to die prejudice that exists in the Western world, I presume, right? It's stronger than so many other things that it's almost embarrassing, and I have problems myself to explain it to people because no matter how much you insist, they just will not, they won't be willing to accept it. And it's very dangerous because it's a dramatically superficial oversimplification of scientific culture in the first place, and essentially a lazy attitude to say, okay, well, there will be a technology will solve it for us, right? Well, they don't understand that everything has to do with essentially your moral capacities and politics, most of all, and also the art of war that has virtually as technology being a decisive factor, basically has nothing to do, and it and that especially, and but also the resources, the availability, properly, how much does it cost, economics, if you want. The most difficult thing to make understand about the art of war, especially not being about technology, is the following. That is to say, people generally speaking say, but warfare is carried out through technology, right? We develop technologies. Wars have especially given a tremendous boost, not just to even military technology itself, but to everything. Like, we owe to war some of the greatest accomplishments in the history of human civilization, from medicine to if you because that's a condition of pressure that obliges naturally people to find a solution that works, right? Because war has probably this is the single the human activity that has the single greater let's say scientifically observable pressure and, let's say, impossibility of prediction than any other. So in other words, there are much greater changes in history than a single war, but the single war is the field where you can basically get the most of the practical application of what works and what doesn't, right? Maybe you can screw up an entire civilization for a millennium of moral collapse, and we wouldn't even understand it in the process. Whereas war shows us something much more directly, and in a way that you cannot really calculate, but on the same outcome of the war. And that's also what the art of war itself is based on. Most people say, just look, the example they always bring on is, I don't know, World War I, right? It was about World War I was fought the way it did, and this is the proof that technology makes doctrine, because if it hadn't been for shells and machine guns, there would have been trench warfare. So the asinine and dramatic and upsetting mistake that people do by speaking out these things, together with all what comes with, for example, the delusion of the butchers, or this idea of the intrinsic evil, people are psychopaths, only psychopaths make wars and things like that. Let's not degrade the video by falling into culturalism, because that should be even properly be erased from history, in my opinion. But the idea is that they do not realize that, I don't know, a frontier like the one lasted for 4 years, just moving a few tens of kilometers, stretching from Switzerland to the North Sea, was the product not of machine guns or shells, but of the fact that there were, certain industrial powers that were fundamentally in balance, in equilibrium, in that very specific international situation. France, Germany, Britain, etc. And that, for example, in other fronts, war was fought essentially in a different way, and there wasn't that position of warfare, at least not in fact, this exasperation that it is to be observed on the Western Front. So what did the person do? They cross out all the background, right? That is to say, you erase reality, you deny all the reasons why those countries were fighting, with what their demographic, industrial, economic producing power was really about, what was the broader and ever-changing international situation, and how in fact the same war went, and etc. No, you basically narrow it down. You extraneate all of this. That is factually what made the thing. Literally, the Germans, after the first Marne, had the option to have peace, right? Okay, an unfavorable one, but a much more favorable one than one in 1918, after millions of dead people of a country was they simply chose it. Like, there was a choice, right, that could have been different, that wasn't motivated by any deterministic factor, because there is nothing deterministic about this either, right? Etc., etc. We should make a video on the Schlieffen plan at some point, and to properly show how, for example, you could easily say it was like, if you were to reason methodologically in this way, you could say another thing, like those 16 years old 1.0 that says war is all about logistics, and there are people out there that thinking that logistics is even more important than strategy. This is something that has nothing to do with the art of war. With all strategic studies, it's a complete declaration of total strategical illiteracy, but people like to think like that. Why? Because it's seducing to think that it's the single factor that is decisive. What I actually don't see is that it's like the tip of the iceberg, right? You have what actually matters is the entire iceberg, but you decide to pick the very little top and pretending that is decisive. If it is not 50% plus 1, that is not decisive. The fact that machine guns or shells were used in that sense has nothing to do, for example, with the capacity, with the doctrine of employment of the same, with the motivation of the country, with even banally simply the numbers, the theater of the war, all those things. Overall, right, as von Clausewitz says, the decisive one is literally the last thing, right? It's the one that after which the one side gives up the fight, right? It's nothing like, especially a technology that is, by the way, used by both sides. So if you really want, because the other dramatic mistake is picking essentially one side and not considering both sides, and how war is always naturally a struggle between moral forces that reciprocally influence each other, and therefore, if you have, by the way, the same technology like the Westerners had at that point, those things in terms of asymmetry counterbalance themselves, right? So it's not really about that, right? Even the Western Front could have gone differently if other things had gone differently that have, in fact, nothing to do with the military technology that was employed there. And even the mismatchings of doctrine that existed before World War I were actually not as they're usually portrayed, it is to say they literally thought they would be fighting like, the Napoleonic warfare with a complete, movement war. But they already realized what technology surely had brought by itself in the system, but they misconceived the whole thing at a much broader level. That is, in fact, doctrine eventually makes use of technology as a mean to an end, right? It's with technology, it's a bit like the same instrumental relation between politics and war, right? Technology, like war in itself, is an option. It's a tool. It's an object. It doesn't have anything in itself that makes the thing work, right? In order to employ a technology, you have to find an adequate doctrine of employment. Otherwise, it doesn't work, right? The French invented the mitrailleuse in the 60s of the 19th century. That was such an advanced technology for the time that it basically served to nothing, because they during the French-Prussian War, because they hadn't found an adequate doctrine of employment, right? It was some German battalion was completely torn to pieces, like in one sector, but the French lost ruinously. And why? Because of course the Prussians had a superior doctrine and even a less advanced technology, by the way. The mitrailleuse worked dramatically well. When? During World War I. During World War I, the mitrailleuse on the Western Front was excellent for that task. And that is the proof of how technology has practically nothing to do with its own effectiveness per se, right? It's always instrumental, and it's tactics that make technology, and the other way around is true just by a dramatically undecisive margin, right? A very low one, a very marginal one. And I'm sure there was a point I was trying to make, but that's where it leads, right? Technology has a very small capacity of influencing tactics. If you look at what tactics conceptually are, what strategies conceptually are, what politics conceptually is, right? And there is no doubt that technology is important, because of course in such enormous systems, a technology can literally make the difference between, I don't know, even hundreds of thousands of people lives or deaths, saying better. But in a war that kills tens of millions, that may not be that important even, right? And again, the balance of the Western Front was not due to the fact that the technology had bogged down any army at the time unavoidably, because in the Eastern Front it wasn't true, in the African Front it wasn't true, in the Mesopotamian Front it had brought in part to a statization of warfare in relative terms to other times, but it wasn't like the Western one. The Western Front wasn't equal at the same time, so hence technology was not decisive, right? It was never meant to be. And again, all these countries fought with the same technologies, right? That in that sense are also many. That is, it's not just a technology, right? There are so many different industrial systems and intersections with them. It was a great problem, especially in case of a world war. So many adaptations and things that of course never quite work the way they are supposed to be since the beginning, and therefore adapt on such unpredictable factors that have nothing to do whether you employ the most updated thing or not, or whatever, right? And military history overall is showing this basically all the time. So doctrine is everything. Technology without doctrine is nothing. It's literally nothing, right? And also because technology has to be served, by the way, by an apparatus, by a system, by certain logistics. So don't we take those in consideration? Don't we see how dependent technology itself is and needy, and how ineffective it gets in some circumstances? The same goes for Stirrup, right? Forgive me for the long digression about World War I, but that is even more punching, because if you consider the technological potential in the early 20th century compared to the one, I don't know, of the 9th century, right? The latter is simply ridiculous, right? It's something that consistently doesn't even exist. And peoples at the time fundamentally had the same technologies as well, right? And one of the reasons, for example, there is still so much misunderstanding in general about these things. Again, it's the oversimplification of the idea. Paradoxically, people today are more interested in the differences between, I don't know, peoples of antiquity or the Middle Ages than moderns or contemporary peoples. Whereas the differences between the earlier are ridiculous compared to the one of the latter, right? And the latter is also something closer when we literally live in, and that we kind of don't care because we assume that for some reason it's not even important, because even living in this world, we understand, of course, that politics is more important than technology, for example. So why should we think it was something like that in the past as well, right? What happened with the stirrup specifically is that it by itself, it basically didn't change anything. Like, we find certain stirrups very early on, right, during, I don't know, the early 7th century, so many places that even we are lucky even to find organic ones that didn't perish for some reason. And we see that, I don't know, that there are tombs of little girls, for example, who, you know, with graves with literally of little girls with stirrups. In a time in warfare where we know that the stirrup wasn't that widespread. So you understand what the functionality there was. They wanted to make this little girl learning how to go on horseback. I hope, you know, in the tragedy, maybe she died exactly because of a horse accident, because that's how risky it is, frankly, even to have such a lifestyle. But and this in a sedentary war in Western Europe, right? And you realize that, you know, the full-grown men devoted to war there and literally cutting in half the same children, etc., didn't even feel the need to use the stirrup. And so that tells you everything, right? Aside from the fact that, you know, what's the difference there, right? What happened? What happened is that early cavalry, in that sense, was much less intensely trained on a systematic base than it was before. Why? Because the resources that were dedicated to it were less, right? I don't know, as we were saying before, the Macedonians, the ancient Macedons, had essentially a feudal society, right? They were big landlords with pastures, but they had this, you see, or even in their onomastics, think about Philip, horses, lover, all these things. They were deeply soaked into this aristocratic equestrian war, and therefore they had a strong cavalry. Because they had the means, they had the mentality, they had that distribution of wealth. In ancient Greece, even a very close one in this case, as you understand, in Hellenized Macedon, etc., was completely different, right? It was a completely different wealth distribution. There were different political forms. So infantry was dramatically more available, effective in terms of cost ratio benefits. It wasn't necessarily something radically developed. As fundamentally the Macedons would invent an infantry was much more effective in a combined armed tactics than what had been the classical hoplitic one in itself. So even that was the point, that you can do things with different means, and therefore cavalry didn't quite develop that much. The same goes for the Romans. The Romans, contrarily to popular opinion, had actually very strong cavalry. Just they had a few of it. Right, and for them it was more convenient to just borrow it from the auxiliaries, right? They also didn't, you know, emerge in a place where cavalry was particularly developed on its own. Right, in Western Europe, basically, there were lots of like horse-loving cultures. I don't know, the Gauls were obsessed with horses, but they didn't actually have a strong cavalry, and that's part of the mistake that it's done in this regard, aside from misreading historiography, is properly associated to the idea that just if you have cavalry, or you have, I don't know, an armored horseman, that has to mean that it has to do with the collective quality, collective training, and therefore the military quality of the same. This is absolutely not the case, because those were not really feudal systems, right? Maybe the Gallic one, compared especially to the rest of the Celtic world, was more like, because the wealth was more concentrated, and don't think that in fact the Gallo-Roman society, when the Franks arrived, didn't in favor in this sense with this pre-existing Celtic reality, but especially the Roman latifundium, and the fact that it hadn't really gone destroyed that much during the migration era, a bit like in Spain, differently from, I don't know, Britain or Italy, where the latifundium had been razed to the ground, had favored the concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer people. That is typical of the Frankish, and especially the Merovingian, which becomes a dynastic war, not like a popular one, and the Carolingians. So what does this mean in practice? This means in practice the following: that first of all, there are enough people that have enough resources to train for a lifetime and literally spending their entire life on horseback, plus together with other people, right? It's not that an ancient, I don't know, hero in the tribal, I don't know, Proto-Slavic world wouldn't have like a lifestyle that was even more individualistically and radically developed in terms of horsemanship as an individual. But of course, if this wasn't, if the the necessity, for example, just to fight on horseback wasn't there, because maybe, yeah, this guy was something exceptional, but still there were much more guys that were on foot, and that even if he was so that great, he couldn't really break through. At that point, he would have had preferably dismounted to fight in certain situations. When you have so many of these people, what first of all happens in civilization is that the more advanced the military culture and the least it becomes individualistic, right? So the idea of the warrior is the idea that, there's a tribal society where there is no other stability but brought by, the enormous effort that the individual can keep together, because altogether it's dramatically unstable. And tribes are, generally speaking, they do not bring advanced military cultures, because fundamentally they lack professionalism in the first place. When professionalism starts developing in the Carolingian War, you see these guys training collectively. That is to say, not only they know how to go on horseback, which everybody in the past, at least the oligarch, knew how to, right? But to fight collectively and intensely in a thickly packed formation that can literally smash into the enemy lines because of this enormous psychophysical impact that it can achieve, right? At that point, what happens is that factually the single knights the single horsemen in this context are brought to, compared to when they were in smaller packs and even individually, to charge literally against enemy formations. First of all, among each other, right? Which is even worse, because it's double speed, right? It's not just like infantry, as the example I always make. Cavalry charges were normally something like optimally at least at 45 kilometers per hour, right? Because if you go more speed, it's even more difficult to maintain alignment, and therefore, if you lack that order, you simply, make the charge abort, and literally everybody dies, and it's a freaking mess. And it's also about the trade. It's mostly psychological, right? The idea of cavalry charge is not even just a direct charge, no matter what. It's like testing the enemy lines, cohesion here and there, even with individual charges, right? There is in this, constantly, testing ground, especially for the younger elements that still have to acquire, respect and rise to the ranks. This idea, okay, we will use the young one who is more reckless, and you can make it do, just like in today's military, by the way, certain things that, I don't know, a 30 years old would say, whoa, slow down, man. Because young people are crazy, right? They don't have their prefrontal cortex still, fully formed. And so they're designed at that age in order to learn, even the hard way, to expose themselves to reckless things. And that's how they were employed, right? That's why in all these military systems, doesn't matter whether they were mounted or not, right? The younger ones were mostly skirmishers. Why? Because they were already young warriors. They hadn't looted enough, so they had a lighter equipment. They were more biologically, physically elastic as young people. They were good for skirmishing, right? It was very risky, it was crazy, it was more individualistic in nature, but for this very reason, in fact, less effective, because skirmishers do not really have a great impact in the first place. And that's what they had to do, right? The battle line was formed fundamentally by the more the veterans, like the more full-grown men with greater experience, greater equipment, something like that, could maintain also a longer. They was more resilient. They had seen it all before. At least hopefully for them, they were well enough, trained, and they really had that experience. for that matter. So in cavalry it happens fundamentally the same thing, right? When you can form really a unit for the not for the first time in history, but in a moment in history where the specific weight of cavalry, properly from a military point of view, has increased so much, this cavalry has to functionalize itself for the election role of cavalry, the only one actually, smashing, attacking, right? So if you have to impact against an enemy formation for real, you have to increase the means for keeping yourself on the saddle. Like we know from Islamic authors of the Reconquista, that Spanish knights literally anchored themselves to the horses, because at impact you could literally be catapulted tens of meters away. It would have been ruinous. People died like crazy. I can think of all the broken bones. Sometimes you wonder in these contexts, like how many crippled, like it would have been a disaster, right? Actually, our orthopedy was the only developed, the only decently developed medical branch, because it's very material, it's very mechanical. So how to put a bone together, it's something, definitely within the reach of those times medical understanding. But concretely, like, these were lethal situations, and at that point, rather than relying how it had mostly been with this, if you want more elastic, flexible employment of cavalry, mostly on your thigh muscles, right? Because that's what fundamentally you develop as a horseman, and you have to stay on horseback without saddle or without stirrup, etc. You need something that makes the work for you, and the stirrup naturally helps you a great deal. So what actually happened in this process that was centuries long, which also proves that therefore the stirrup was there, was known, it was a ridiculously inexpensive thing for somebody who had to just have an armor, a body armor, and a horse, right, and all the resources to train in order to be able to fight like that. You understand that it didn't change basically almost anything, that it was this increased collective training that forced knights to need these devices could increase the stability on horseback for that specific role that they were to cover in an ever more functionalized way all the time. And that's the reason why in parallel, in fact, from this passage from the early to the high Middle Ages, you see that the warrior per se transitions into what we call a knight, even if there weren't radical differences, for example, from a technological point of view, right? Did really, arms and armor equipment change that much from, I don't know, the 8th to the 13th century? I mean, essentially, right? For the function has to be in its full. No, right? They're basically the same things, basically the same equipment. There are some differences, but they're not evidently just by themselves surpassing what the essence of a heavily armored horseman with a lance and a shield, and it basically goes there to fight like. And plus other things, like of course these guys dismounted often, they fought also in different ways. I mean, this is fairly well known, right? So look at the Bayeux Tapestry. By that time, still not all horsemen, not all heavy cavalry had stirrups, right? So just think how long it took from the Avars, even if there had ever been this kind of, the stirrup was brought in Europe by the Avars, which is another concept that, frankly, it's too mechanistic in nature, right? Surely the West didn't have to wait for the Avars to know what a stirrup was, right? It's just that that's the people that brought it en masse because they were habituated to use it more than the Westerners, and that therefore, we say, that's the first time we see it there. But again, the functionality took centuries and centuries before, Western cavalry decided, okay, we really need that like a standard thing. So actually, especially in doctrine, as the question says, there wasn't any great change. The doctrine was changed due to these other factors that were very gradually changing over time, that quite didn't have it's very even difficult to find certain properly steps of development, because normally when there is a political change or social change, this is normally mirrored at a military level at the same time, and by all the other levels, right? So we can be relatively sure that in those centers it was being an advancement. We can see it from so many hints, right? But if we had to take a picture of what cavalry was throughout all this time on a regular base, we would see a very small difference, and at least they would have not perceived it at that very time as the side. The way properly they saw history was different, and the way that they would portray themselves also brings to some methodological interpretations, whatever, that we have to be aware of. But fundamentally, the stirrup in itself wasn't that impacting in a general sense, right? Because the shock force of cavalry developed for reasons that hadn't to do with the stirrup. It had to do with the possibility of these lords to breed, stronger horses, to train on them more effectively, to train themselves together with other horsemen, right? Increasing the collective training, which is all, and it's also about naturally the burden, the moral pressure that these elite had properly in front of each other and the rest of the community to take the lead. These are the same centuries in which Europe is literally being made by these people, that very far from living in a closed society based on barter and all these things, we're actually managing in an ever more rational way, in the absence of a fixed authority of a state, etc. We're taking matters in their own hands, and they were literally leading, and it was an expectation from it. It was something that went beyond. It was literally that ultra elite that the cavalry was to become, right, within those few centuries, at the point that eventually during the low Middle Ages, there is even the detachment of the ultra heavy cavalry, and together with other political and social divides from other types of cavalry that were still very heavy for previous time standards, but were part of a more articulated tactical employment that at that point was starting. It's still anachronistic for those times, so it starts being kind of more doctrinal, if you want, in a rationalized sense, right? And that will bring to certain specific changes also in the art of war and so on. So in arms and armor, you can see it. So also the other point the question said, it seems to be a consensus on the Crochet lengths being out prior to Stirrup's introduction. Absolutely, that's another thing that if you want doesn't even make sense, meaning that ever since cavalry existed, crochet lengths like overarm, underarm grip, like throwing lengths was there always. Like there was never a time in history in which cavalry didn't use weapons in the most radically different and bizarre and unimaginable ways that the tactical contingencies would make them do, right? Crochet lengths existed. Of course it existed, right, before, and it actually has, you could argue in there, it has barely anything to do with the broader with the technology itself, right? It was just, again, like a functionalization for maximizing the full impact in that specific formation with that specific aim and so on. But for that matter, even in later medieval times, you can see knights using, they could even throw their lance. They could do whatever, right? So that becomes more usual for when cavalry was employed in that elective role. But for that matter, always remember that, which is often overlooked, that knights per se, throughout most of the Middle Ages, were fundamentally and especially the high Middle Ages, so that the acme of mounted warfare per se, were actually the protagonists in every single kind of tactical situation, right? Even sieges, people say, because sieges, like the importance of infantry. The importance of infantry, even there, is relative. You would think, that let's say better. it was all infantry, right? Because you cannot attack, a tower with a horse. But there were things like that too. You would be amazed, especially, with more modest fortifications. There are. I found some interesting accounts, even on such things. But the idea is that the knight still led the assault, right? That the rest of infantry was following essentially these mounted knights, even in the assault. So these knights were habituated by default of to literally perform any kind of action in any kind of circumstance, because simply they were trained to do it. They weren't just trained naturally for mounted combat, right? And sometimes still in air, because cavalry development was different in different places also, rather than in different times. Then of course they dismounted. There were certain tactical contingencies in which it was better to receive the enemy dismounted than on horseback, especially that maybe had not even technically to do with anything, of course, technological, nothing even doctrinal. Let's say I have some, I've studied a bit, like even the 100-Year Wars, these things. There were some things were a bit traditional. There were certain ideas that were starting being doctrinal in nature, but we often underestimate how the strategic contingency would make a certain array necessary for another. That is to say, if you are dramatically inferior in the number of cavalry, at that point it's better if you try if you dismount, right, and you find a better solution, because you already kind of know that at that point you wouldn't stand a chance, and so you would have to rely on naturally on other tactical elements and so on. But let's say it was more normal than we think for knights to dismount, right? Even though their pride, their identity, their deal was to fight on horseback, but the greatest part of tactical situations could also present quite readily with the necessity of dismount, right? For numbers of the enemy, for terrain, etc. This is something that you find even in, like, during the migration era. The Strategicon talks about these things for the forefathers of this knights, right? For the Germanic people, there are certain situations where you fight on foot, you fight on horseback, even if you're the same guy in the same battle, right? So, in conclusion, I hope to have been exhaustive, at least for this question. This was, let's say, a short version of my approach to the topic, but I tried to cover, nevertheless, a bit all of the deal. Of course, Stirrup had virtually nothing to do with increasing shock force of cavalry. That was something completely that people completely, usually at least, don't see, because they still don't understand such a banal principle, such as the fact that collective training is what makes warfare, and that individuality is subordinated to it as much as technology is subordinated to tactics. And the same reason why people don't understand this is because they can't understand the difference between a tribalism and the dignity of human civilization, right? And that's why it's so important to understand it, because it's literally a scalar thought. It's not like an opinion that you can shift on horizontally. It's literally being at a higher stage, right, than of development, and that's what, in my opinion, we're not in fact seeing that much, improving collectively, and where we should exactly be more cohesive, and that's also part of the reason why the art of war and military history are at this point so ridiculously developed in Western studies, and why, or in any other world, say, for that matter. But still, that's not a good sign of, through the absence of strategic culture, properly of civic education, right? And one really doesn't understand why all this kind of geostrategic and all this bullshit that centers that are emerging can even remotely work if they don't even study military history, They don't study the art of war. Maybe they don't even know what the difference is. So you can't factually have that if you don't go through military history the hard way, not the pulp that you can find, I don't know, on Wikipedia or reading a bunch of Ospreys. It's literally about you should take, you know, a campaign and all its battles and all the sources about that and studying them seriously, with all a set of pre-requisite competences over and over and over again throughout all your life. That's basically the only way you can acquire strategic culture, because if it is just a saying, even if it's just my videos, for example, I hope I can help in some way, but they will never, if you don't really at least try to make the effort, here it's a general consideration to make for my audience, you will not get the expertise through that, right? Because there is a huge difference between reading, learning, studying, and understanding, right? They are all different things, and we are accommodating ourselves with ever cheaper solutions that actually mirror the complete lack of interest and inadequacy and incompetence that we see all around, right? So for today, I hope it was exhaustive. I always like to actually talk about this topic, as I think probably it's clear by now, and I think the author of the question, for the opportunity I had to talk about this. So for now I thank you. Hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.